Chapter 1, An Invitation to Darkness. My name is Alex Carter, I'm 23 years old, and a year ago I made a mistake that haunts me to this day. It all started with a stupid bet I made with my friends in an abandoned place I was never supposed to go. Every town has a place shrouded in horror stories. In ours, it was the old Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital, closed almost 40 years ago. Legend has it that the hospital was closed after a horrific experiment that went out of control. It all seemed like just a fairy tale to scare children with, until I decided to check it out myself. It was an ordinary Saturday night. My friends Jack, Eric, and Leah and I had gathered at my apartment to play cards and relax. But a few beers quickly turned our conversations into discussions of small-town legends. "So, Blackwood," Jack said, lighting a cigarette and smiling, "do you really believe in these ghost stories, Alex?" "No, of course not," I answered, trying to sound confident. "Then prove it," he said, challenging me. "Spend a night in Blackwood. By yourself." I laughed, but something inside me went cold. "This is ridiculous," Leah interjected. "This hospital is dangerous. The ceiling could fall or the floor could cave in." "Because there are no ghosts there," Eric added, smiling. "But Alex is right, everything is falling apart." I tried to stay calm, but Jack kept pushing. "Come on, man. Show that you're not one of those who cower before legends." Under pressure, I agreed. It was stupid, but I didn't want to look weak. We agreed that I would spend the night in Blackwood, and in the morning we would meet at the entrance. Late at night, I drove up to the building. The lights of my car illuminated its facade, a huge, gloomy structure with broken windows and walls covered with graffiti. It looked like a creature that had died long ago, but continued to watch the world with empty eyes. I took a flashlight, my phone, and a sleeping bag with me, although I doubted I would be able to sleep. As I approached the door, the wind howled in my ears, making me look around. But it was just the sounds of the night, I convinced myself. The hospital door was off its hinges, and I walked inside without difficulty. The smell of dust and dampness immediately hit my nose. The light of the flashlight caught the old furniture, fragments of rusty chairs and broken equipment lying scattered on the floor. The corridor stretched out before me, dark and endless. The walls were covered with peeling paint, and in some places, tree roots were growing through them. I walked slowly, trying not to make any noise, although my footsteps echoed, seemingly louder with every meter. I stopped in front of a door with a sign on it, "Staff Break Room." It looked as if the staff had left the place in a hurry, half-empty cups on the tables, chairs pushed back as if they had just gotten up to leave. There was a magazine on one of the tables. I opened it, and my eyes stopped at a handwritten entry. October 31, 1982. Patient 117 has disappeared again. The security systems failed and he escaped to the basements. Time to gather everyone and end the experiment before it's too late. I felt goosebumps run down my spine. Legends have always told of cellars where some horrific experiments were rumored to have been conducted. But I always thought they were fiction. While I was thinking about the recording, I heard a sound in the corridor. It was something between a knock and a creak, as if someone was slowly moving a chair. My heart pounded in my chest, and I listened. The sound repeated, this time closer. "Just don't start panicking," I told myself. I quietly went out into the corridor and shone my flashlight into the space. There was no one there. Only emptiness and long shadows that seemed to move. I decided that it was better to move on than to stand still. Every step I took was like thunder in silence. It seemed to me that I was walking for an eternity until I reached a crossroads. One corridor led upstairs to the patients' wards, the other downstairs to the dark cellars. I took a step toward the stairs down. My hand clutched the railing, and my heart pounded in my chest. The legends were right, this was where it all began. Something in the air changed. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was alive, heavy, and almost audible. At that moment, I realized that leaving the hospital would not be easy. Chapter 2: The Way to the Basement. I stood in front of the stairs leading down to the basement, trying to collect my thoughts. The smell of dampness and metal was getting stronger with every breath I took. The flashlight in my hand was shining, but its light seemed to be lost in the thick darkness. Just go down, find the evidence, and come back up, I told myself. It should have been easy. The steps were made of concrete and covered with a layer of dirt and dust. They creaked under the weight of my every step. When I reached the middle, the sound of footsteps in the basement made me freeze. It was not an echo of my movement. Someone was walking downstairs. I turned off the flashlight, leaving me in complete darkness. Standing still, I listened to the sounds. Slow, heavy footsteps. They moved from one end of the basement to the other, stopping for a few seconds and then continuing. My mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was a homeless person hiding here, or an animal. But none of it seemed likely. I took a deep breath, turned on the flashlight, and continued down. The basement was bigger than I had imagined. Its walls were covered with old tiles, partially peeling off. Broken chairs, rusty strollers, and overturned tables were lying on the floor. Everything looked like people had left the place in a hurry. In the center of the room was a large metal door, its surface covered with scratches, as if someone had tried to get out. Above the door was a sign that read, "Access denied. Staff only." I took a step forward when I heard a sound behind me. It was a faint tapping sound, like fingernails scratching a surface. My heart pounded, and I turned around sharply, pointing the flashlight into the darkness. There was no one there. It's just your imagination, I thought, but deep down I knew it wasn't true. I approached the door, gently pulling the handle. It didn't give way, the lock held it tight. But when I touched the surface of the door, cold went through my fingers, as if the metal was not part of the building but something else. I heard a sound behind the door. At first it was faint, like a whisper, then stronger. I could hear the words mingling, repeating the same thing. "Help! Help!" My mind was screaming for me to run, but my feet were frozen. I wanted to leave this place, but at the same time, something was forcing me to stay. I gathered my strength and pointed the flashlight at the lock. It looked old, but broken. As if someone had tried to enter earlier, but hadn't finished what they started. A rusty crowbar was lying on the floor nearby. I picked it up, trying not to make any noise, and started hitting the lock. Each blow sounded loud in the void, but I didn't stop. After a few minutes, the lock gave way and fell to the floor with a dull ring. The door opened with a heavy creak, and I stepped inside. Behind the door was another room. It was much smaller and looked like a makeshift laboratory. Old medical beds, metal tables, and shelves with ampoules and syringes. There was a notebook on one of the tables. Its pages were yellowed, but the entries were still legible. Patient 117 continues to show signs of aggression. After the last procedure, his skin began to change and his eyes became unnaturally black. We cannot stop the experiment until we complete the observation phase. My heart sank. It couldn't be true. Such recordings only exist in horror movies. I heard a sound behind me. Slow, heavy footsteps approaching. My flashlight began to flicker and then went out completely. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to turn on the light. The footsteps stopped. The darkness around me was absolute, and I felt something cold touch my neck. I rushed to the exit, leaving my notebook and everything else behind. Footsteps followed me, and the whispering grew, mingling with my own breathing. When I reached the stairs, something grabbed my arm. It was not a human hand. The skin was slippery, and my fingers ended in sharp claws. I broke free and started to climb upstairs, hearing it chasing me. I ran to the first floor, but the door I came in through was locked. From the other end of the corridor, I heard a low, guttural sound, like a roar. I hid in one of the rooms and locked the door, hoping it wouldn't find me. But the sound of footsteps outside the door told me that this was just the beginning. Chapter 3: Shadows That Hunt. I stood in the dark room, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. The sound of footsteps stopped just outside the door. Something was out there in the hallway, and I could feel its presence compressing the air around me. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to be heard throughout the hospital. Suddenly, the door handle began to move slowly downward. The metal creaked, and I stood back, looking for something to protect myself with. I noticed an old metal lamp in the corner of the room, grabbed it and raised it, ready to strike. The door opened. But there was no one behind it. I took a cautious step forward, sticking my head out into the corridor. It was empty. But this did not bring relief. On the contrary, it was even scarier. I decided to move on, looking for a way out. The corridors branched off, and I was constantly hesitating which way to go. Every choice seemed wrong, but standing still was even worse. The walls here looked different than on the ground floor. They were covered with strange inscriptions. As if someone had scratched them with something sharp. The phrases were incomprehensible, but I could recognize some words. "Excuse me, they are watching, do not open the door." At the end of one of the corridors, I saw a door that looked stronger than the others. It was covered with metal, and a faint red light was coming from underneath. This must be the way out, I thought, although something in me screamed that it was a trap. I took hold of the handle and pulled. The door gave way, and I found myself in another room. This room was completely different. It looked almost neat. The walls were covered with old photographs, and there were old lamps on the table that barely illuminated the room. I walked closer to the wall to look at the pictures. They showed people in white coats, obviously doctors. But their faces were damaged, some of the photos were cut up, others were smeared with black ink. Among these images, I noticed something strange, a group photo of me. I recoiled, not believing my eyes. It was clearly an old photo, taken decades ago, but I recognized myself. I was standing among doctors and patients, dressed in a medical coat. "It's impossible," I whispered, feeling my blood freeze in my veins. On the table next to the lamp was a yellowed envelope. It was signed with my name. My heart was pounding as I opened it. Inside were several sheets of paper filled with text. "Alex, if you are reading this, then you have already begun to understand. This place is not just a building. It has a memory. And you are a part of that memory." My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold the paper. "You came back here because you were called. And you will never leave until you finish what you started." I dropped the letter when a sound came from behind me. It was a whisper, but not one voice, dozens of them. They spoke at the same time, and I could not understand a word. I rushed to the door, but it was locked. The whispering intensified, turning into voices. They were angry, mocking, and seemed to be laughing at me. The lamps began to flicker and the shadows on the walls came to life. They moved, forming figures that began to move in my direction. "No, no, this isn't real," I kept repeating, pressing myself against the wall. One of the figures stepped forward. Its outline was blurry, but I could see its eyes black, empty, and looking straight at me. She raised her hand, and I heard one word that broke the silence. Stay. At that moment, the door behind me opened. I rushed forward without looking back and found myself in the corridor again. The corridor looked different now. The walls were darker, and the light of the flashlight barely made it through the thick darkness. But I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw a figure. It was a man, but something about his gait was wrong. She was limping, her head was tilted to the side, and her arms were hanging like a doll on strings. "Who are you?" I shouted, but she did not answer. It was getting closer, and I realized that it was not just a person. Her eyes were the same as the shadows in the room. I started running, looking for a way back to the stairs. But the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the footsteps behind me were getting closer. This was not just a house. It lived and hunted. I turned around and saw a figure. It was a man, but something about his movements was off. He was limping, his head tilted unnaturally to the side, and his arms dangled like a doll on strings. "Who are you?" I shouted, but he didn't answer. He kept coming closer, and that's when I realized, this wasn't just a person. His eyes were the same as the shadows in the room. I started running, desperate to find my way back to the stairs. But the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the footsteps behind me grew louder with every second. This wasn't just a house. It was alive, and it was hunting. Chapter 4: Corridors That Never End. I ran without looking back. Each step echoed in the dark corridors, and the footsteps behind me grew louder and louder. They seemed to be too close, but when I turned around, there was no one behind me. Only emptiness and eerie shadows that moved as if the walls themselves had come to life. My breathing became labored, my legs were shaking, but I couldn't stop. The fear that something, no matter what it was, would catch up with me made me run forward, despite my exhaustion. I turned the corner and stopped. The same corridor was in front of me again. The walls were covered with scratches and strange symbols that I could not recognize. It was impossible. I knew for sure that I had been through this corridor before. "Are you kidding me?" I shouted, hoping someone would answer. But only my own echo came back to me. I picked up the flashlight and illuminated the walls. Now the scratches looked even scarier. They formed words: "You shouldn't have come back, it's waiting for you, stay." It seemed to me that the air had become thicker. It was hard to breathe, and I felt as if something invisible was slowly squeezing me. A sound came up ahead. It was a loud scraping sound, like metal scratching stone. I pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the light couldn't penetrate the thick darkness. "It's just your mind, Alex," I told myself, trying to calm down. But even my own voice didn't convince me. Suddenly I noticed movement in the darkness. Something big, fuzzy, slowly approaching. It moved as if it were sliding on the ground, and its outline seemed blurred, like a shadow reflecting on water. "No," I whispered, stepping back. The footsteps behind me became audible again, and I realized that I couldn't stand still. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, trying to find a way out. The corridors seemed endless, but now they were changing. The walls were moving, doors I hadn't seen before appeared and disappeared. There was a sign on one of the doors: "Doctor's Room Number 3. I didn't think, I just pushed the door open and entered. Inside was a small room with an overturned table, several broken cabinets, and a chair in the middle as if waiting for someone. There were paintings on the walls. They looked stereotypical, images of doctors and nurses smiling. But their faces were blurred, as if someone had deliberately destroyed the details. There was a piece of paper on the table. I picked it up and shined my flashlight on it. Patient 117, unstable condition. His skin began to crack and his eyes began to dissolve. He claims to hear voices. We must complete the experiment by the end of the week, otherwise we all risk falling victim to this curse. My hands were shaking, and I felt my heart clench. I threw the paper on the table and turned around. The door behind me was no longer there. The room became cold. The light of the flashlight began to flicker, and I heard a whisper. It was coming from behind my shoulder. "Why did you come back?" I turned around, but there was no one there. The whisper repeated, this time louder. "This is your place. You will never leave." The walls of the room began to move, slowly shrinking the space. I felt the ceiling seem to sink and the darkness become denser. Enough. I screamed, but my voice disappeared in the chaos. Figures began to appear out of the darkness. Their outlines were indistinct, but I could see their eyes, empty and black as the abyss. They stood silently, just looking at me. I backed up against the wall, trying to find a way out, but there was none. "You belong to us," one of them said in a voice that sounded like a combination of many voices at once. Suddenly, something grabbed my arm. Cold fingers squeezed my wrist, and I felt myself being pulled forward, into the darkness. I broke free and ran toward the opposite wall, which seemed a little lighter. My body was moving almost mechanically, as if my survival instinct had taken over from fear. Suddenly, a door appeared in front of me. It looked different from all the others, clean, white, with a shiny handle. I grabbed it and pushed the door open, running forward. For a second, I felt the darkness disappear. I found myself in a large room illuminated by a dim green light. It was empty, except for one object in the center, a large mirror. I walked closer. The mirror showed me, but my reflection did not move. My voice, but not from my mouth, spoke. This is only the beginning. Chapter 5, The Face in the Mirror. My heart was beating so fast that I felt like I could hear it in my every nerve. I stood in front of a mirror that did not reflect my movements. My reflection remained motionless, as if it were a separate being watching me. "What is this?" I whispered, trying to understand what was happening. There was an oppressive silence in the room. The air was cold, and the walls seemed to be shrinking around me. The mirror began to change. The shadow around my reflection grew darker until his face became distorted. Its eyes turned black, and its mouth stretched into an eerie smile. It spoke. "You are looking for a way out, but you have become part of it. Who are you?" I screamed, stepping back. The mirror no longer reflected me. In it I saw a scene from the basement, where there were medical tables, but now they were filled with figures. The people were lying motionless, their faces covered with masks that looked like respirators, but their eyes were open and pointed directly at me. I closed my eyes, trying to escape from this nightmare, but when I opened them, the scene in the mirror changed. Now I saw myself, but it was a different me. He was older, with empty eyes and a creepy look. I could feel reality splitting around me. The mirror cracked, and a black liquid began to flow from the cracks. It flowed to the floor, forming a puddle that slowly grew. I took a step back, but the floor under my feet shook. I fell, but instead of being on the ground, I was swallowed up by darkness. There were no sounds in this space, only coldness and the feeling that I was no longer in control of my own body. Is this the end? I thought. But suddenly I heard voices. They were similar to the ones I had heard before, but now they sounded clearer. They were the voices of people begging for help. They are here. They are always here. I saw 3 people in front of me. Their faces were blurry, but I knew they were the ones who had left these recordings and conducted these experiments. "You have to finish what we started," one of them said. "What do you mean?" I shouted. "Everyone who comes here becomes part of the house. Now it's your turn." I opened my eyes and realized that I was standing in the corridor again. But now it was different. The walls glowed with a faint green light, and the floor was covered with a layer of black liquid. I saw another door ahead. It was tall, with a large symbol in the center that I could not recognize. "This is your way," said a voice behind me. I turned around and saw my shadow. But it was not me. It was a figure that moved just like me, but its face remained hidden. "You have to choose." I went to the door, but when I reached out my hand, I felt something stop me. It was a shadow that was now standing in front of me. "If you go in, you will never come out again." I hesitated, but I knew there was no turning back. I pushed the door, and it opened with a deafening creak. Behind it was a large room illuminated by bright white light. There was a table in the center, and a book on it. I walked over and saw that my name was on the cover. Opening the book, I saw records of all my actions in the house. Every step I took was recorded, including moments I didn't even remember. Suddenly, the pages began to fill with new words. "You will complete the cycle. You will become a new observer." "No, I don't want this," I screamed, throwing the book. But it did not fall. It hung in the air, and the words on the pages began to change. "Everyone who comes in has to leave something behind. You leave yourself." I saw my reflection on the blank page. My face began to change, and I realized that I had become a part of this place. Chapter 6, The Cycle That Never Ends. When I read the last words in the book, I felt a sense of hopelessness. The walls around me began to move, narrowing the space. It was not a simple house. It was something more, something alive, with its own consciousness and rules. The book hung in the air in front of me, and its pages continued to fill with text. I tried to retreat, but with every step I took, the walls came closer. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, but all I heard in response was a loud whisper coming from all sides. "You will leave your story here. Just like everyone else." "No. I will not stay here." But the walls seemed to be laughing at me. Everything I saw disappeared, and I found myself in complete darkness. In the darkness, I saw them. The figures that had been haunting me from the beginning were now standing in front of me. There were more of them than I could count. Their faces were still blurry, but I knew they had been here for a long time. "Why are you here?" I asked, although the answer was obvious to me. One of the figures took a step forward. Its hand reached out to me, and I saw something that made me freeze. In its palm was a photograph. It was of me. But it was not a moment from my life that I remembered. In the photo, I was standing in the same place, surrounded by the same figures. "This is impossible," I whispered. "You have always been here," the figure said, its voice sounding like many voices at once. The darkness around me began to move, and I felt the floor under my feet disappear. I was falling. When I opened my eyes, everything looked familiar. I was in the living room of the very house where this whole story began. The sunlight was coming through the windows, and everything looked so normal that I almost believed it was just a dream. I stood up and saw the same book on the table. But now its cover was blank. "This is impossible," I repeated as I came closer. When I opened the book, the pages were blank except for one phrase. "Your story is just beginning."